The Force is light and full of shadows.
Before we dive in, check the link in the description if you want exclusive timelines, members-only videos you won't find on YouTube, all on our Patreon. The mud was the first thing he noticed, not the weight of the armor, not the clone troopers crouched in the dark around him, not the alien sky overhead, boiling with violet clouds that flickered with artillery light like a dying star refusing to go out. The mud. It pressed against his boots with a living resistance. The black soil of Umbara pulling at every step, like the planet itself was trying to swallow the men walking across it. It smelled of iron and rot, and something sweeter underneath, something biological and wrong, like a wound that had been closed too quickly over something still alive inside. Vader stood in it and breathed, not through a respirator, not through filters and tubes and the mechanical wheeze of a life support system that had kept him alive and imprisoned simultaneously for over 2 decades. He breathed through his own nose, his own lungs, pulling in the poisoned air of Umbara in great unassisted gulps, and the sensation was so overwhelming that for 3 full seconds he simply stood there while clone troopers moved around him in tactical formation, and he did nothing but exist inside a body that actually worked. His hands, he looked at them, both of them. Gauntleted in Phase 2 clone armor, yes, but underneath that armor were fingers. Real fingers connected to real palms, connected to real arms that extended all the way to real shoulders, without a single mechanical joint in between. He flexed them inside the gloves and felt the pressure of his own grip, the resistance of his own tendons, and something in the back of his throat tightened with an emotion he did not have a name for anymore. Then the artillery hit 30 meters to his left, and a clone trooper was simply gone, replaced by a crater and a sound that the human brain processes half a second after it should, and Vader's body moved before his mind caught up with where he was. Umbara, the knowledge arrived not as a vision, but as a weight. The 501st Legion, the Umbaran campaign, the shadow world whose population had allied with the Separatists, whose cities were dug into the dark like tumors, whose soldiers fought with light-based weaponry that cut through standard clone armor with the casual efficiency of a man trimming a hedge. He knew it because he had commanded it. Not in this body, not in this moment, but in the life that lived behind his eyes like a recording that never stopped playing. He had stood on the bridge of a star destroyer and received reports from this planet. He had read casualty numbers that meant nothing to him by that point in his existence. Hundreds of clones, thousands, the arithmetic of attrition tallied and filed and forgotten. He had never stood in the mud with them. General Skywalker? The voice came from his left, low and clipped in the way of a soldier who had learned to conserve everything, including sound. Rex. Captain Rex. Phase 2 helmet tracking toward him, the distinctive blue markings catching the ghost light of Umbara's sky. Sir, we need to move. Scout snipers in the ridgeline. Vader looked at Rex and felt the collision of 2 timelines meet behind his sternum. In another life, this man had executed Order 66 with the rest of them, had turned a weapon on his Jedi general without hesitation, the inhibitor chip overriding 20 years of loyalty in the span of a single transmitted command. Vader knew this not from guilt, but from intelligence reports he had read while hunting survivors. Rex had eventually had his chip removed, had joined the rebellion, had lived somehow through everything. But that hadn't happened yet. In this moment, Rex was 23 years old, and completely loyal and looking at his general with the calm professional concern of a soldier who had noticed that his commanding officer had stopped moving during an artillery bombardment. Sir, I heard you, Vader said, his own voice, young, unfiltered. No vocoder, no harmonic distortion, no mechanical baritone that had once made Imperial officers go pale simply by hearing it echo down a corridor. He sounded like a man, an ordinary young man, and the strangeness of it sat at the back of his teeth, like a coin. Rex held his position for exactly 1 beat, the way a soldier does when he is deciding whether the unusual behavior he just witnessed requires a report or a response. Then he jerked his head toward the ridge. Second platoons pinned at the eastern approach. Kix says 4 wounded, 2 critical. Vader processed the battlefield the way he had processed every battlefield for 20 years, not through emotion, through architecture. He extended his senses outward and felt the living signatures of the men around him. 38 clones deployed in this immediate sector, and beyond them, further up the ridge, the sharp, cold presences of Umbaran soldiers whose biology registered differently in the Force. Harder, more angular, like objects rather than people. He felt, further still, something that confirmed where in the timeline he had arrived. Ahsoka was not here. The 501st had deployed without her, which meant this was after her departure from the Order, after the trial, after he had failed her completely, and told himself it was the will of the Force rather than the failure of a man who should have fought harder for someone who deserved better. She was alive somewhere, but not here. Not his to protect or fail again. Not yet. He filed the information and returned his attention to the ridge. "Pull 2nd Platoon back to the drainage channel," he said. "Don't reinforce the forward position. The Umbarans want us to stack bodies in that approach. We're not going to." Rex didn't question it. One of the qualities that made him exceptional, Vader thought, was that he recognized the difference between an order that needed context and an order that simply needed execution. He clicked his comm twice and the repositioning began. It was then that the communicator on Vader's wrist chimed with the specific tone that indicated a priority transmission from off-world. He knew before he answered it. "Skywalker." Obi-Wan's voice came through with the audio distortion of a long-range transmission, slightly flattened, the warmth of it reduced to its functional components. But it was still recognizably him, still the voice of the man he had left burning on Mustafar, still carrying that particular quality of calm that Vader had spent 20 years alternating between despising and quietly grieving. "The Council has reviewed the Umbara situation. Given the complexity of the campaign and certain strategic developments in the Outer Rim, the decision has been made to reassign the 501st to the Ryloth Corridor. Pong Krell is being dispatched to take command of your forces. Effective." "No." The word came out flat and absolute, the way a blast door closes. A pause on the transmission. Not long. Obi-Wan had survived too much to be easily startled. But Vader could hear the quality of the silence shift. "Anakin." "I heard the order, Master. The answer is no." "That isn't how a military chain of Pong Krell," Vader said, and something about the way he said the name made Rex glance at him from 3 meters away with an expression that was visible even through a clone helmet. "Tell me what the Council knows about Pong Krell." "He's a capable general with an exemplary. What do they know about him? Not his record. Not his citations. What do they actually know about the man they're about to hand 4 battalions of clones to on a planet where the darkness itself is a tactical environment?" The pause this time was Obi-Wan recalibrating. Vader recognized the frequency of it. His former master was deciding whether this was Anakin being impulsive and emotional, which was the default assumption, or whether there was something underneath the resistance worth listening to. It was a calculation Obi-Wan had always made too slowly and too charitably. His record is constructed," Vader said. "I'm not leaving. The Council is not standing in Umbaran mud, watching clones die in a meat grinder that someone designed specifically to maximize our casualties." He kept his voice level. This was not young Anakin's frustration boiling over into insubordination. This was a man who had read the after-action reports, who knew the numbers, who knew exactly what Pong Krell was. "I'm requesting the Council delay the reassignment until I can provide an intelligence assessment of the strategic situation on the ground." 24 hours. The transmission crackled. 12, Obi-Wan said finally, with the tone of a man offering a concession he already knows he'll regret. "Accepted." The transmission closed. Rex was still looking at him. The captain had the admirable quality of his face being completely unreadable behind his helmet, but his body language was a different document entirely. And his body language was currently saying that General Skywalker had just refused a direct council order on a priority channel with the calm of someone reading supply manifests. "Sir," Rex said carefully, "Krell has a reputation. I know. The men have heard things. About his tactics. About how he treats. I know, Rex." Vader looked at him directly. "He's not coming here. Not to these men. Not to this campaign." Rex was quiet for a moment. Then, in the understated way of a soldier who had learned to hear what officers weren't saying, "Understood, sir." Vader turned toward the ridge and walked forward into it, the mud pulling at his boots with every step. And for the first time in either lifetime, he walked toward a battle not because he had been ordered to, not because Palpatine required a victory, not because the Empire needed a demonstration of power. He walked forward because 38 men behind him were still alive, and he intended to keep them that way. The ridge had a name in the 501st's informal cartography. The clones called it the Grinder. Not because anyone had officially designated it as such, not because it appeared on any tactical display with that label, but because names emerge organically from experience. And the experience of attempting to move through the eastern approach of Sector 7 on Umbara was the experience of being fed into something mechanical and patient and entirely indifferent to the material it was processing. Vader learned this by watching. He stood at the mouth of the drainage channel where Rex had repositioned 2nd Platoon, and he did not speak, and he did not move, and he simply observed the battlefield with the complete attention of a man who had spent 20 years reading environments the way other people read faces. The Umbaran fortification at the ridge crest was not a single structure. It was a system. 3 overlapping fields of fire anchored by hardpoints that had been cut into the rock itself, not built on top of it, meaning that orbital bombardment would collapse the ridge before it neutralized the guns. Below the hardpoints, the approach was funneled through a natural choke point barely 8 meters wide, bordered on both sides by terrain so broken and steep that flanking required either climbing equipment or the kind of reckless vertical assault that converted soldiers into statistics. Someone had chosen this position with genuine intelligence. That was the detail that young Anakin would have noticed last, if at all. The emotional engine of that boy ran too hot and too fast for the cold patience that tactical analysis required. He would have seen the obstacle and moved against it, because movement felt like progress, and stillness felt like failure. Vader stood still. "The hard points have a dead angle," he said quietly. Rex moved up beside him, his visor tracking the ridge crest. "Sir?" "The left anchor. The gun emplacement has a depression in its firing arc, approximately 15 degrees, starting at the base of that secondary rock formation." Vader pointed, not gesturing broadly but precisely, a single extended finger indicating a specific geography. Someone decided the terrain itself made that angle unnecessary to cover. They were correct about the terrain. They were wrong about what we'd do with it. Rex studied the indicated position for a long moment. Vader could see the captain running the geometry in his head, the trained spatial reasoning of a soldier who had been doing exactly this kind of calculation since he was old enough to hold a weapon. It's a 30-meter crawl across open ground to reach that formation. In Umbaran light conditions, that's survivable in squads of 3, not in formation. Vader finally moved, turning away from the ridge and walking back along the drainage channel to where the rest of the available men were positioned. "I need your best crawlers, not your best fighters, men who know how to become part of the ground for." He got on his comm. Fives found Vader 2 minutes later, which meant Fives had been watching him since before he'd called for volunteers, which meant Fives had decided to be involved before he'd been asked to be involved, which was the most accurate possible summary of everything that made Fives both exceptional and exhausting. "Heard you need someone invisible," Fives said, the particular energy in his voice that lived just below cocky and just above professional, the tone of a man who had survived enough to have opinions about his own survival. "I need someone quiet," Vader said. "Those are different things." Fives absorbed this without offense. "Echo's the quiet one. I'm the creative one. I'm aware." Something about the flatness of the response made Fives pause, his helmet tilting slightly in the way clones did when they were recalibrating their read of a situation. Vader had noticed this already, the way the men around him kept performing these small recalibrations. General Skywalker was behaving differently, and they could all feel it without being able to name it, the way you can feel a change in atmospheric pressure before you can see the weather it predicts. Echo appeared at Fives' shoulder, with the quiet efficiency that had always defined him. Phase 2 armor still carrying the scoring marks from 3 engagements ago, because Echo considered cleaning his armor mid-campaign to be a waste of time better spent on other things. He said nothing. He looked at the ridge, and then at Vader, and then back at the ridge. 3 teams, Vader said. "You 2 lead one each. I lead the 3rd. Rex's head turned. "Sir, I can't authorize the General to—" "You're not authorizing it, Rex. I'm telling you." Another of those pauses that had been recurring since the drainage channel. Rex had the specific discipline of a captain who understood the difference between an argument he could win and an argument he was having purely for the record, and this was the second kind. "Noted for the log, sir. Noted." They moved at what passed for dusk on Umbara, which was not darkness so much as a different quality of wrongness in the light. The planet's sky shifted from its baseline violet gray into something deeper and more absolute. the bioluminescent ground cover that covered the terrain, providing just enough illumination to navigate by, and just enough to make every shadow a potential silhouette. Vader went flat against the ground and felt the mud against the front of his armor, and pulled himself forward, with his elbows in a motion that the body remembered even when the mind was somewhere else entirely. Beside him, two clones, whose names were Sketch and Pointer, moved with the boneless efficiency of men who had been doing exactly this since Kamino's training halls, who had been taught by flash learning programs how to be horizontal and patient and invisible. He had never learned this, not in this body's original life. Young Anakin had charged. Young Anakin had run forward with his lightsaber already lit, burning bright in the dark, announcing himself like a signal flare. The subtlety had come later, had been hammered into him by attrition and failure, and the slow education of watching people die because he had been visible when he should have been invisible. He was visible now only to the Force. He extended his senses ahead of them in a thin, careful thread, not the broad sweep he had used in the drainage channel, but something more precise, more surgical, feeling for the specific signature of Umbaran soldiers at the base of the rock formation. Two of them, positioned back to back, in the way of soldiers who had been trained to cover each other's blind spots, alert, weapons held with the loose readiness of professionals on watch, rather than the tense grip of men who expected something to happen. They didn't expect something to happen. Vader moved faster. He reached the rock formation 4 seconds ahead of where the Umbaran soldiers' awareness registered his presence as a threat. And in those 4 seconds, he was already moving through the gap between the rock and the hardpoint's dead angle, already past them and into the position that the Umbaran commander had decided didn't need covering. The decision that followed was made without drama and without hesitation. He neutralized both soldiers with the Force before they could fire. Not violently, a precise compression of consciousness, 2 quick pulses that rendered them unconscious in the space between one breath and the next. They slid to the ground without a sound. Sketch looked at them, and then at Vader with a silence that contained several questions he had decided not to ask. "Mark the position," Vader said quietly. Five's team reached the opposite anchor point 30 seconds later, Vader feeling their arrival through the Force before the comm click confirmed it. Echo's team had taken a longer path around the central approach, and were now positioned directly below the primary gun emplacement, close enough that the Umbaran crew above them were audible. Vader pressed his back against the cold rock of Umbara, and looked up at the underside of the hardpoint, and breathed through his nose, and thought about architecture. The gun was bolted into the rock using Umbaran construction methods, which he had seen in exactly 0 technical briefings, and was now reverse engineering from the 15 centimeters of mounting bracket visible below the emplacement's floor plate. The bracket was load-bearing. Everything above it was load-bearing. The rock itself was not the foundation, the bracket was, which meant that the rock was incidental. He reached up with the Force, not a dramatic gesture. He kept his arm against his side, and simply reached, a focused telekinetic thread that found the bracket and applied pressure not to break it, but to rotate it slowly, the way you loosen a bolt by degrees rather than by force, working with the thread rather than against it. On the ridge above them, something shifted, a groan of metal that could have been wind. Then the primary gun emplacement tilted. Then it fell inward, into the fortification, rather than outward, collapsing the interior support structure and taking the Umbaran crew with it, in a controlled implosion that was, Vader noted with clinical detachment, significantly more efficient than an explosion would have been. The overlapping fields of fire collapsed with the anchor. Rex's voice came over the comm immediately, the particular controlled urgency of a captain watching an opportunity materialize on his tactical display. "Sir, the approach just opened. I see it. The 501st can push through in the next 4 minutes before they reposition their reserves. Your orders?" Vader was already moving back toward the channel, Sketch and Pointer flanking him, the mud pulling at his boots with the same patient hunger it had shown since the moment he arrived on this planet. "Push," he said. The 501st moved through the grinder like water finding a crack in stone, and the Umbaran line that had processed 3 attempted advances into casualties processed this one into nothing at all, because there was no one left to man the guns. By the time Vader reached the ridge crest, the engagement was effectively over. Clones were securing the hardpoints, setting up their own overlapping fields of fire, converting the fortification from an obstacle into an asset with the practiced efficiency of men who had done exactly this on a dozen other planets, in a dozen other campaigns. Jesse found him at the crest, looking out at the terrain beyond the ridge. The next Umbaran position was visible in the middle distance, another cluster of darkness against a dark landscape, another system of interlocking problems waiting to be taken apart. "Sir," Jesse said, with the particular quality in his voice that clones used when they were trying to find the respectful version of a question that didn't have a respectful version. "How did you know about the dead angle in that gun emplacement?" The pre-mission briefing didn't have that level of detail on their fortification layout. Vader looked at the next position. "I've seen this kind of construction before," he said, which was true in every way that mattered and accurate in none of the ways Jesse was asking about. Jesse held the question for another moment, then let it go with the pragmatic grace of a soldier who had learned that some answers didn't come, and the mission continued regardless. Behind them, the 501st secured the ridge. Ahead of them, Umbara waited. And somewhere in the direction of the planet's capital, in the deep dark of a campaign that had barely begun, something that Vader had not yet accounted for, was already in motion. He could feel it in the Force, the way you feel a splinter before you see it. Something wrong, something patient, something that wore the face of an ally. The command post smelled like ozone and burnt circuitry. Someone had rigged a portable holoprojector to a field power unit that was running at approximately 40% of its rated capacity, which meant the tactical display floating above the table flickered every 8 seconds with the reliability of a dying pulse. The map of Sector 7 strobed in blue-white light, casting the faces of the men gathered around it in alternating shadow and illumination, making everyone look like they were being repeatedly remembered and forgotten. Vader stood at the head of the table and said nothing while his officers finished arriving. Rex, Fives, Echo, Jesse, Kix, who had come directly from the medical station and still had someone else's blood on the forearm of his armor and a wide brown streak that he hadn't noticed or hadn't cared about. Hardcase, who was the last to arrive because Hardcase was constitutionally incapable of being anywhere quietly and had stopped to help 2 troopers move an ammunition crate on the way, because that was the specific texture of who Hardcase was. They gathered around the flickering map and waited. Vader let them wait for exactly long enough that the waiting itself communicated something. Young Anakin had always filled silences, had talked into them, moved through them, treated stillness as a problem requiring a solution. The men around this table were accustomed to a general who arrived with energy already in motion, who thought out loud, whose planning process was visible and kinetic, and occasionally alarming. This general stood at the head of the table and looked at the map with the focused patience of someone reading a document they had read before and were now reading for specific errors. "The supply line," Vader said finally. Rex moved immediately, his finger finding the relevant corridor on the map. "The Umbaran main supply route runs northeast from the capital through this valley system. It's how they're feeding the forward positions we've been hitting. Cut it and their eastern defensive network starts degrading within 18 hours, Vader said. After that, their ammunition reserves at the forward hardpoints drop below operational threshold. After 36 hours, they're rationing power cells. After 48, they start pulling troops from secondary positions to consolidate around the capital approaches." The room was quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something unexpected has been said with complete certainty. Kix looked up from the map. Jesse and Fives exchanged the kind of look that clones exchanged when they were confirming that the other person had also noticed the same thing. Rex watched Vader with the steady, careful attention he had been directing at his general since the drainage channel, accumulating data, not yet certain what it added up to. "That's a very specific projection, sir," Rex said. "It's accurate. How are you? Because I've run this campaign before." Vader said it without inflection, without the particular energy of a man confessing something. He said it the way you state the boiling point of water. "Not on this planet, but the tactical logic is identical to 6 other engagements I can name where a fortified urban position was being supplied through a single primary corridor. The degradation curve is consistent. Trust the numbers." Rex held the pause for 1 beat, 2, then, "Yes, sir." It was not agreement. It was the professional suspension of disagreement, pending further evidence, which was the most useful thing a soldier could offer a commander whose reasoning they couldn't yet follow. Vader noted and moved on. "The supply route is defended," he continued, pulling the map's focus northeast with a gesture that dragged the relevant terrain into the center of the display. 2 mobile patrol units running staggered intervals. Here and here. He indicated the positions without hesitation. The patrol timing creates a window of 4 minutes and 30 seconds at this point in the valley, where both units are out of mutual visual range. Hardcase leaned forward, his helmet tilting at the map with the particular enthusiasm he brought to any tactical discussion that involved the possibility of explosives. 4.5 minutes is enough time to place charges on the valley's choke point, collapse the walls, block the route, and be gone before the second patrol comes back around. That's exactly what we're not doing, Vader said. Hardcase straightened. Sir, a collapsed choke point takes the Umbarans 6 hours to clear with heavy equipment. An alternative route exists 12 kilometers north. They reroute, we've lost our window. Vader looked at each of them in turn, moving around the table slowly, the way a man moves when he wants the people listening to understand that what he's saying is for all of them, not just whoever he happens to be facing. We don't destroy the supply route. We poison it. Echo spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the particular quality of a man whose mind had already run ahead of the conversation and was waiting for the rest of it to catch up. Tracking devices on the supply containers. We let the route keep running. We see everything that moves through it. That, Vader said, and more. He reached into the map and expanded the capital overlay, the distant target that the entire campaign was theoretically aimed at, but that currently existed in their tactical picture as a vague cluster of Umbaran infrastructure signals and thermal readings. The capital's power grid is distributed, independent nodes feeding a central hub. Taking out the hub directly requires penetrating the city's defensive perimeter, which at current troop strength would cost us more than we'd gain. He let that land, but the supply route carries power cells to the forward positions. If those power cells are modified before they arrive, a feedback loop, Echo said, and there was genuine appreciation in his voice, the tone of a man who recognized elegant engineering when he heard it. The modified cells get installed in the forward hardpoint systems. The hardpoints transmit the feedback up the power relay chain toward the capital grid, and the damage propagates inward rather than requiring us to push inward ourselves. How long to modify the cells? Rex asked. 4 hours if Echo handles the technical work. 2 hours if I help him. Rex looked at Echo, who gave the small nod of a man confirming a timeline he had already calculated independently. Then Rex looked back at Vader with an expression that was asking several questions simultaneously and choosing to voice only the operational one. And the insertion? Getting into the supply route without being detected? Umbaran patrol signatures, Vader said. Fives, who had been leaning against the wall with the posture of someone who looked relaxed and wasn't, pushed off and came to the table. Sir, you and 3 others, you're not going to the supply route as Republic soldiers. A pause. Sir, Umbaran biology is, you won't pass as Umbarans. You'll pass as their droids. Vader pulled up the Umbaran mechanized unit data, the spider-like automated platforms the Umbarans used for supply transport. Their cargo drones use encrypted transponder codes that cycle on a 20-minute interval. The encryption pattern is not random. It's based on a separatist cipher architecture I recognize. He had recognized it in the field outside the drainage channel, when an Umbaran drone had crossed within his force-sensing range, and he had felt the mechanical regularity of its transpondered pulse, the specific rhythm of a cipher he had broken 14 times, as Vader, and never seen in this timeline because it hadn't existed in this timeline yet. I can give you the next 4 cycle codes. That's 80 minutes of unquestioned access to their supply infrastructure. The room processed this. Jesse said carefully, Sir, how do you know their encryption architecture? The same way I knew about the dead angle in the gun emplacement, Vader said. And the evenness of his voice closed the question without answering it, the way a properly hung door closes without slamming. Jesse looked at Rex. Rex looked at the map. They kept moving. The planning took another 40 minutes. Vader allocated it precisely, cutting off discussion when it circled back to ground already covered, pushing through objections that were procedural rather than substantive, absorbing the 2 genuine tactical concerns that Kix raised about medevac positioning if the insertion went wrong, and incorporating them without acknowledgement of their quality, simply adding them to the plan because they were correct. At the end of it, Rex walked with him to the edge of the command post, away from the others, to the place where the fortifications' captured wall looked out over the terrain they had taken, and the terrain they still needed to take. The Umbaran landscape spreading out under its sick violet sky, in a silence broken only by the distant, irregular percussion of engagements in other sectors. "You're going to tell me something," Vader said, before Rex could choose how to begin. Rex was quiet for a moment. The captain had the quality of a man who respected directness enough to meet it directly. "The Council gave you 12 hours. That was—" He checked his internal clock with the automatic precision of a soldier who always knew what time it was. 9 hours ago. "I'm aware. In 3 hours, Obi-Wan Kenobi is going to transmit again. And this time the order isn't going to be a request. Also aware." Rex looked out at the terrain. His voice dropped to the register he used when he was saying something that wasn't in any manual. "The men are noticing, sir. Not the way they notice when something's wrong. The way they notice when something's different. When the grinder opened up tonight, Sketch told me he'd never seen a general move through a field insertion like that. Pointer said you neutralized 2 Umbaran soldiers without drawing your lightsaber, and he couldn't tell how. A beat. I couldn't tell how either." Vader said nothing. "I'm not asking you to explain yourself," Rex said, with the clarity of a man establishing a boundary rather than probing for information. "I don't need to understand something to trust it. What I need to know is whether whatever is different about you right now is going to keep these men alive." Vader looked at the landscape. The bioluminescent ground cover pulsed faintly in the dark below the ridgeline, the living light of a planet that had evolved in permanent shadow, organisms that had learned to generate their own illumination because the alternative was blindness. "Yes," he said. Rex nodded once, the short definitive nod of a man who had received the answer he needed. He turned to go back inside. "Rex." The captain stopped. "Krell is still coming. The Council won't hold the reassignment indefinitely, regardless of what I achieve here. When he arrives—" Vader stopped. He was moving into territory where the words he needed required context he couldn't provide. He found a version of the truth that fit the available space. "When he arrives, watch how he talks about the men. Not what he says about strategy or objectives. How he refers to the troopers when he's discussing acceptable losses." Rex was very still. "Sir. The number he's comfortable with will tell you everything you need to know about what he intends to do with the 501st. A long pause. The distant percussion of another sector's engagement rolled across the ridge like weather. "Understood, sir," Rex said quietly, and this time the understanding in his voice was not the professional suspension of judgment. It was the real thing, heavy and certain, the understanding of a man who has just been told something he already suspected, and has now had it confirmed by a source he has decided to believe. He went back inside. Vader remained at the wall. In 3 hours, Obi-Wan would call. In 3 hours, the Republic would attempt to remove him from this planet, and replace him with a man who would spend the next phase of this campaign finding creative ways to destroy the 501st from the inside. And Vader had approximately 180 minutes to make himself so operationally indispensable that the removal became tactically unconscionable. He reached into the Force and felt the supply route to the northeast, felt the patrol timing cycling through its staggered intervals, felt the 4-minute 30-second window opening and closing with mechanical regularity like a lock that didn't know it was being studied. He pushed off the wall. There was work to do. The valley had its own weather system, not the planetary weather of Umbara's upper atmosphere, the artillery-lit clouds and the perpetual violet pressure of a sky that never quite committed to being a sky. This was ground-level weather, a phenomenon created by the temperature differential between the valley floor and the ridge walls, cold air pooling in the basin and interacting with the bioluminescent ground cover's metabolic heat to produce a mist that sat at approximately chest height and moved with the unhurried confidence of something that had been doing this for a very long time before anyone arrived to notice it. Vader moved through it like a blade through water. He was alone. This had not been the plan. The plan had involved Fives and 3 others running the transponder codes while he coordinated from the ridge. But the plan had developed a complication 40 minutes into the insertion when Fives' comm had gone to static, and the Force had told Vader, with the flat certainty it reserved for facts rather than possibilities, that one of the patrol units had changed its interval. Not randomly, changed it with the specific irregularity of a patrol that had been given new instructions. Someone had told them to vary their timing. He had sent the others back and gone forward alone, because the arithmetic was simple. 4 men moving through a compromised patrol pattern produced 4 times the signature of 1 man moving through it. And 1 man who could feel the patrols through the Force before they were within visual range was not the same category of problem as 1 man who couldn't. The mist swallowed his footsteps. He extended his senses ahead and the thin surgical thread he had developed over the last 2 hours of moving through Umbaran terrain. Not the broad sweep that would announce his presence to anything force-sensitive in range, but a narrow-focused probe, a question rather than a statement. The nearest patrol unit was 230 meters northeast, moving south at a pace slightly faster than its previous interval, which confirmed that the timing change was deliberate rather than the natural drift of soldiers getting tired. The second unit was... He stopped moving. The second unit was not where it should have been. He held his position in the chest-high mist and let his senses expand carefully, feeling outward like a man feeling for the edge of a table in a dark room, and found the second patrol unit positioned on the eastern ridge wall of the valley at an elevation that put them above the mist line, which meant they had a clear sight line to the valley floor that the first patrol's movement would drive anything toward. It was a compression trap. Move away from the approaching patrol and you walked into the elevated unit's field of fire. Hold position and the approaching patrol walked over you. Vader looked at both positions in the Force simultaneously and thought about who had designed this. Not the patrol commanders. This was not the improvisation of soldiers in the field adjusting to a perceived threat. The geometry was too clean, the positioning too deliberate. Someone with genuine tactical intelligence had looked at this valley and understood how a covert insertion would move through it, and designed a response that accounted for the exact behavior an experienced infiltrator would default to. He filed the information about Umbaran command intelligence as significant and chose his third option. He went up. The valley wall was not a climbing surface in any conventional sense. It was fractured volcanic rock covered in a biological growth that the briefing documents had classified as non-hostile flora, but which responded to pressure with a contraction reflex that made every handhold feel like gripping something that wanted you to let go. Vader climbed it using the Force to supplement grip and balance, moving vertically through the dark with the methodical patience of a man who had learned that speed and recklessness were not the same thing, even when they felt identical. He came over the valley rim 40 meters from the elevated patrol unit. 4 Umbaran soldiers, their light-based weapons were oriented toward the valley floor, watching the compression trap close below them. They were good. Their positioning was disciplined, their spacing correct, their attention directed exactly where their orders told them to direct it. They were not watching the rim they were standing 15 meters from. Vader came across the ground horizontally, using the broken terrain for cover the way it was meant to be used, cover not as a barrier, but as a series of interrupted sightlines. He reached the first soldier's blind spot, and was among them before any of them processed that the rim behind them had produced something. He did not use his lightsaber. It was a calculation he had been making consistently since arriving on Umbara, and he was aware that the calculation was being noticed by the men of the 501st. The lightsaber was light. The lightsaber was sound. The lightsaber was the announcement of a Jedi's presence in an environment where the strategic value of his presence being unknown was currently very high. Beyond the tactical logic, there was something else, something he was less willing to examine directly. The force flowing through this body without mechanical interference was so precise, so responsive, that, using the lightsaber felt like bringing a thermal detonator to a conversation that could be resolved with words. The 4 Umbaran soldiers went down in sequence, unconscious, silent, lowered to the rock by telekinetic assistance before their bodies could produce the sound of falling. He looked at them for a moment. Their biology was still registering in the Force with that hard, angular quality he had noticed since arriving, but at close range there was something else underneath it, something that complicated the hardness. They were afraid, even unconscious. The physiological signature of fear was present in their systems, the chemical residue of sustained high-alert exposure, the specific biological cost of fighting a campaign on a world that required you to be afraid of its darkness, even when you were native to it. He left them alive and moved northeast toward the supply route. The supply containers were stacked in a natural alcove, where the valley floor widened into a loading area, a temporary depot that the Umbaran logistics operation used as a transfer point between their heavy transport vehicles and the smaller drones that moved material to the forward positions. There were 11 containers currently staged, 6 power cell shipments, 3 munitions packages, 2 marked with Umbaran script that Vader's knowledge of separatist supply chain logistics told him were probably medical materiel. Echo was already there. This was not the plan either. Echo stood at the second container from the left, with a toolkit open on the ground beside him, working with the focused efficiency of a soldier, who had arrived early because the alternative was arriving on time. He looked up when he felt Vader's approach, which meant his peripheral awareness was better than most, and said, very quietly, "Fives, calm, went down." "I know." Echo returned the look with the steady patience of a man who had made a decision and was prepared to defend it without apology. There was something in Echo's bearing that Vader had been cataloging since the command post, a quality of self-containment that sat differently from the other clones' versions of discipline. The others were disciplined by training and reinforced by experience. Echo was disciplined by something that had happened to him specifically, something personal and irreversible that had restructured his relationship with fear into something more architectural. "How much time do you need?" Vader said. 40 minutes for all 11 containers if you keep watch. You have 30. Then I'll need 30. Vader took a position at the alcove entrance and extended his senses outward across the valley floor, feeling for the patrol unit that was still running its approach pattern below the mist line. It had reached the compression trap's southern boundary and was beginning to reorient, its pattern now suggesting it would loop back north and eventually come within range of the alcove. Behind him, Echo worked. The sound of it was minimal, the specific minimal of a trained technical specialist who understood that silence was a component of the job. Small contacts, careful adjustments, the occasional soft click of a modified cell being reseated in its container housing. Vader tracked it in his peripheral awareness the way he tracked everything, not focusing on it but keeping it registered, a background signal against the primary data of the patrol movements. 7 minutes in, Echo said quietly, "You moved the elevated unit." It wasn't a question. Vader didn't answer it. 4 soldiers, neutralized and left alive. That's what the Force told you to do, or what you decided to do. Vader considered it honestly, which was more than most people's questions about his decisions deserved. Both. Echo absorbed this without comment, his hands continuing their work without interruption. Another 3 minutes of silence. Then, on Camino, they taught us that a Jedi's connection to the Force was the reason they were worth following. That it wasn't just combat ability, it was judgment. A beat. The Jedi we've served under have different kinds of judgment. That's a careful way to say something. It's the accurate way, Echo said. Some of them treat the Force like it makes their decisions for them. Some of them treat it like it gives them better information to make their own decisions with. Another soft click. Container 6, sealed, moving to 7. You're the second kind. I've seen maybe 2 generals who were... Vader said nothing. Outside the alcove, the patrol was completing its loop. The elevated unit's positioning, Echo continued, and his voice had taken on the tone of a man thinking through a problem rather than making a point. That wasn't standard Umbaran patrol doctrine. I've been studying their movement patterns since we landed. They don't use elevation-based compression setups. It's not in their tactical vocabulary. Vader went very still. It was not a stillness born of surprise. It was the stillness of a man who has been watching a shape form in the dark and has just recognized what it is. You're saying someone taught it to them, he said. I'm saying the geometry of that trap was familiar. It's in the Republic Tactical Manual. Section 7, Irregular Terrain Interdiction. Echo sealed Container 9 and moved to 10 without breaking rhythm. Someone with access to Republic doctrine modified their patrol behavior. The implications arranged themselves in Vader's mind with the cold precision of falling dominoes. An advisor. Someone with Republic tactical knowledge embedded in the Umbaran command structure or in contact with it, feeding them the specific information that would make this campaign cost the Republic the maximum number of lives. Not a separatist doctrine exchange, which would have produced a different tactical signature. Something more targeted, more personal. Something that knew the specific campaign's personnel well enough to anticipate how a covert insertion would behave. He thought about the 12-hour window Obi-Wan had given him. He thought about who had known that window existed beyond himself and the Council. He thought about the specific ways in which this campaign had been designed to produce casualties at a rate that would require replacement leadership. He thought about Pong Krell. Echo, he said quietly. When Krell was assigned to this campaign, who processed his tactical briefing package? Echo's hands stopped for the first time. A single second of absolute stillness. Then they resumed. Standard routing. Council office to campaign command. Every officer with operational oversight would have received copies. Another beat. including the Umbara liaison channels that were established for prisoner exchange protocols at the campaign's start. Vader looked out at the mist-covered valley floor and felt the patrol moving through it below, like a hand moving under a sheet, and thought about a basilisk general with 4 arms and a tactical mind that had been building towards something specific for longer than this campaign had existed. "Finish the containers," he said. 30 seconds, Echo said. Vader waited at the entrance and felt the valley breathe around him, felt the mist move against the bioluminescent ground cover, felt the patrol cycling through its compromised pattern below, and thought about the shape of a trap that had been set not for Umbaran soldiers, but for clone troopers, and for the general who stood between them and whoever was setting it. Echo sealed the last container. Done. They moved back through the valley in silence, the mist closing behind them like water closing over a stone, leaving no evidence that they had been there except 11 supply containers that would, within the next 18 hours, begin dismantling the Umbaran forward network from the inside, and one elevation trap that had revealed something far more dangerous than the enemy they had come to fight. Vader climbed back toward the ridge and said nothing, and in the force behind his sternum the dark side pulse that lived there like a second heartbeat beat once, twice, with a particular emphasis that it reserved for moments when it recognized a threat worthy of its attention. He did not disagree with it. The intelligence took 4 hours to verify and 20 seconds to act on. Vader spent the 4 hours doing what the 501st needed him to do visibly, walking the perimeter, adjusting defensive positions, reviewing the captured hardpoints' structural integrity with Jesse, eating a ration block at the command post while Rex briefed him on resupply timelines. He did all of it with complete attention, which was not the same as his full attention, because his full attention was on the problem of Pong Krell and what Echo had found in the geometry of a compression trap that should not have existed. The verification process was not a formal investigation. He had no access to council records, no ability to pull Krell's communication logs, no forensic tools for tracing how Republic tactical doctrine had migrated into Umbaran patrol behavior. What he had was the Force, 20 years of experience reading the architecture of betrayal, and Echo, who had spent the hours since their return from the valley sitting with a datapad and a focused silence that produced, at the end of the second hour, a sequence of 6 tactical anomalies across the last 4 days of the campaign. 6 moments where the Umbaran response to 501st movements had been too precise. Not better than expected. Precisely calibrated. The difference between an enemy that was skilled and an enemy that had been told. Echo laid the datapad on the field table without comment and went back to his post. Vader looked at the 6 anomalies and felt the shape of the thing beneath them, with the certainty of a man reading a familiar signature. Someone was feeding the Umbarans operational data in near real time. The transmission had to be happening within the campaign's own communication infrastructure, using authorized channels with enough access to move information without triggering the automated security flags that Republic comm systems use to detect unauthorized transmissions. That narrowed the field considerably. The campaign had 3 officers with that level of access: himself, Rex, and the general the council was insisting on sending. Krell had been receiving tactical briefings since his assignment was confirmed. Standard procedure, unimpeachable protocol, exactly the kind of routine administrative process that a man with a long-term plan would ensure was established before he arrived, so that by the time he set foot on Umbara, the infrastructure for what he intended to do was already running smoothly. Vader stood at the edge of the command post and breathed through his nose and made the decision that young Anakin would have made immediately and badly. He made it slowly and well. Rex found him at the comm station 3 minutes before Obi-Wan's transmission was due. The captain stood beside him without speaking, which was Rex's way of communicating that he was present for whatever came next, and had no intention of being anywhere else. Vader noted it without comment. The loyalty of these men had a specific texture, different from the loyalty of Imperial officers, which had been the loyalty of people who understood what happened to officers who were insufficiently loyal. This was the other kind, the kind built from shared ground and shared cost, and the simple arithmetic of people who had survived things together and intended to keep surviving them. The comm chimed. Vader opened the channel. Anakin. Obi-Wan's voice carried more weight than it had 12 hours ago. Not anger. Something more complicated than anger. The tone of a man who had spent the intervening period having arguments with people above him on behalf of a person below him and had emerged from those arguments with a position he didn't entirely disagree with. The Council has reviewed the operational reports from Sector 7, the Grinder Offensive. The supply route operation. A pause. Mace Windu used the word impressive. You understand what that costs him. I need 48 more hours, Vader said. A breath on the other end of the transmission. Anakin. Obi-Wan. He used the name deliberately, without the word master in front of it, and heard the quality of the silence change in response. I need you to listen to me. Not as a council representative, as someone who has known me for 10 years and has occasionally been willing to consider that I might be right about something. A long pause. I'm listening. Krell is transmitting operational data to the Umbarans. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones, not the pause of a man choosing his words. The pause of a man absorbing a statement that had just reorganized several things he thought he understood. When Obi-Wan spoke again, his voice had changed registers entirely. That's an extraordinary accusation. I have documentation. 6 tactical anomalies over 4 days, each one corresponding to a window where Krell had access to the relevant operational data through his briefing packages. The Umbaran patrol modification in the Supply Valley used Republic doctrine from Section 7 of the Irregular Terrain Manual. Krell's tactical specialty is irregular terrain interdiction. He literally wrote that section. Another silence. Vader could hear, faintly, the sound of Obi-Wan moving, the specific sound of a man who thinks better on his feet walking across a room. Echo compiled the anomaly documentation, Vader continued. I'll transmit it through secure channels within the hour. What I need from you right now is a hold on Krell's deployment and an immediate audit of the campaign's comm logs for unauthorized transmissions on authorized frequencies. If this is accurate, Obi-Wan said carefully, and I want to be precise about that word, if, then what you're describing is a Jedi general actively working to maximize Republic casualties on an active campaign. That's not a disciplinary matter, Anakin. That's treason, Vader said, and it's not hypothetical. Rex had gone completely still beside him. The captain's silence had changed quality, had become the silence of a man processing something that recontextualized the last 4 days of his campaign's casualty list. Vader felt it in the force beside him, the specific emotional signature of a soldier doing arithmetic he didn't want to finish. I need those 48 hours, Vader said, not to run the campaign, to build the evidentiary record that makes this impossible to dismiss. If I transmit Echo's documentation now without the comm log audit to support it, Krell's record buries it. He's been on the Council's good side for 15 years. I'm the general who refused a direct order 12 hours ago. You know how that reads. Obi-Wan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had the quality of a decision being made in real time, the audible texture of a man choosing a position he knew would cost him something. 48 hours. But Anakin, if the documentation doesn't support the accusation, it will. Then I'll expect the full transmission within the hour. The channel closed. Rex let out a breath that was not quite a sigh, but was in the same family. Sir, if Krell has been feeding them our movements, he has. Then every casualty we've taken since the campaign briefings went out. Yes. Rex was quiet for a moment that had weight in it. Then, in the voice he used when he had arrived at a position and intended to hold it, what do you need from me? The comm logs. Every transmission out of campaign command in the last 5 days. I need them pulled and isolated before anyone with the access to modify them realizes we're looking. Rex was already moving toward the comm station. Waxer has the technical access. He's been running our encryption protocol since Ryloth. I can have him on it in 10 minutes without flagging it as an audit. Do it quietly. Sir, Rex paused without turning around. The men who died at the Eastern Approach, on day 2. 12 of them. The Umbarans were waiting at exactly the position our flanking route should have avoided. His voice was level in the way that level voices are level when the alternative is something that can't happen in front of subordinates. That was in Krell's briefing package. Vader said nothing. There was nothing to say that Rex didn't already know. Rex went to find Waxer. The comm log audit took 3 hours and produced something worse than confirmation. Waxer, who had the specific genius of a soldier who understood communication systems the way other soldiers understood weapons, laid the results on the field table with the expression of a man who had been hoping to be wrong and wasn't. 7 transmissions over 5 days, each one lasting between 90 seconds and 4 minutes. Each one routed through the campaign's authorized prisoner exchange channel, using the legitimate encryption protocols. timed to occur during the regular communication maintenance windows when automated monitoring was suspended. Whoever had set up the transmission infrastructure had understood Republic comm security at an architectural level. Vader looked at the transmission timestamps and matched them against Echo's anomaly documentation with the mechanical precision of confirming something he had already known. Every transmission preceded an anomaly by between 2 and 6 hours. The lead time was consistent with battlefield intelligence, being processed through an Umbaran command structure and producing modified tactical orders. Not instant, deliberate. The signature of a system that had been running long enough to develop operational rhythm. Five stood at the edge of the table, having arrived somewhere in the second hour of the audit, with the complete tactical picture assembling itself in his expression, as he read. He had not been briefed. He had watched the documentation accumulate and reached the conclusion independently, which was characteristic. Fives reached conclusions the way water found cracks, through persistence and the specific intelligence of something that moved around obstacles rather than through them. The 7 transmissions, he said. The 5th one was 40 minutes before the ambush at the processing plant. Tup's squad. His voice had gone flat in the way that voices go flat when emotion has been compressed into something more functional by necessity. We lost 9 men in that ambush. The Umbarans had a second unit staged behind the primary position, like they knew we'd push through the front. Because they did, Echo said from across the post. Fives looked at the transmission log for a long moment. Then he looked at Vader with an expression that contained something that was not a question and not a statement, but the specific thing that exists between them when a soldier has just understood something and is waiting to see if the person with command authority has understood the same thing and intends to do something about it. We build the full package, Vader said, to all of them, to the room. Every transmission, every anomaly, the tactical correlation analysis, the Section 7 doctrine match. All of it compiled, authenticated with Waxer's technical signature on the comm-log extraction, and transmitted to Obi-Wan Kenobi within the hour. And then? Jesse asked. And then we continue the campaign. We take the next position on the route to the capital, we do it cleanly, and we do it in a way that produces a battle record so unambiguous that when the Council reviews what happened on this planet, they understand exactly what the 501st is capable of when it isn't being fed to the enemy. The room was quiet, Hardcase said, with a restraint that was clearly costing him something. And Krell? Vader looked at him. Krell will be handled through proper channels, by the Council, with the documentation we're providing. And if the Council buries it? The question landed in the room and stayed there. Vader let it stay for exactly the right amount of time, long enough to communicate that it had been heard and taken seriously, not so long that the silence itself became an answer. Then we handle it ourselves, he said. But we exhaust the proper channels first, because if we don't, we become the story instead of Krell. Hardcase absorbed this, nodded once, with the specific nod of a man who disagrees with a timeline, but accepts the logic of it. Vader looked around the table at these men, these particular men with their particular histories and their particular loyalty that had been built from something real and was pointed at something real, and felt the dark side pulse in his chest, with the familiar rhythm it used when it recognized that the thing he was protecting was worth the cost of protecting it. He did not tell them that he had already identified the fallback position, that he had already calculated what Krell's response would be when the Council's investigation closed around him, that he had already decided what the 501st's options were if the documentation wasn't enough. Some plans were better held alone. Transmit the package, he said. Then get some sleep. We move on the capital approach at dawn. Not because the Council had approved his deployment, because he had deployed himself, arriving in a shuttle that had filed its flight plan through campaign logistics channels 3 hours before Obi-Wan's acknowledgement of the evidentiary package, which meant the filing had happened before the transmission reached Coruscant, which meant Krell had known the window was closing and had moved through it before it shut. Vader felt him land, not saw, felt. The Force registered Pong Krell's arrival the way it registered certain kinds of weather, not as a presence exactly, but as a change in atmospheric pressure, a heaviness that settled over the captured ridge position, like something large moving into a space that had been balanced before it arrived. Dark side energy with a specific texture, not the volcanic heat of Vader's own darkness, or the cold precision of Palpatine's, but something that had the quality of rot, of something that had been turning for a long time and had passed through the stages of decay into a kind of patient, purposeful corruption. Rex found Vader at the perimeter wall 30 seconds after the shuttle landed. The captain's body language said everything his voice hadn't decided to say yet. "He's here," Rex said. "I know. Council authorization? No." Vader turned from the wall. "Which means he's here because he knows we found the transmissions, and he's decided that arriving in person is better than waiting for the Council to act." A man with nothing to hide waits for authorization. Rex processed this with the speed of a soldier whose threat assessment had been running since the moment the shuttle appeared on scope. "What do? We let him come to us." Krell had to duck to enter the command post. This was not a figure of speech. The Basilisk general stood 2.5 meters tall, his 4 arms carrying the particular kind of physical confidence that came from having spent a lifetime being the largest presence in any room he entered. His dual-phase lightsabers were clipped at his belt, both of them, a detail Vader noted immediately as the choice of a man who had decided he might need them quickly. He looked at Vader with yellow eyes that were not Sith yellow, not the hot corruption of dark-side immersion, but something colder and more considered, the yellow of a predator that had been patient for a very long time. "General Skywalker," Krell said. His voice had the deep resonance of his species' physiology, a sound that seemed to originate somewhere below normal conversation and travel upward. "I understand you've been having a productive campaign." "General Krell," Vader said. He did not stand from the field table where he was sitting. He did not adjust his posture. He looked at Krell the way he had looked at Imperial officers who had arrived in his presence believing that their rank, or their record, or their physical size constituted a form of protection. "Your authorization for this deployment." A pause. Something moved behind Krell's eyes. "En route. The Council is processing the formal paperwork. Then you'll wait outside until it arrives." The command post went very still. Jesse, who was standing at the comm station, became motionless in the way of a man who has just identified the exact moment that something is going to happen and is calculating where to be when it does. Fives, positioned near the entrance, shifted his weight by 3 centimeters in a direction that put him closer to his weapon. Krell looked at Vader for a long moment. The quality of the look was the quality of a recalculation happening in real time. A man revising his model of who he was dealing with. He had arrived expecting young Anakin Skywalker, the emotional Padawan whose reputation for insubordination ran alongside his reputation for brilliance, the general who could be managed through confrontation and authority and the implied weight of the Council's displeasure. What he was looking at was not that. "I see the campaign has matured you," Krell said. Something in his voice had shifted, a microscopic adjustment in tone that moved from the register of superior to subordinate into something more lateral, more careful. "The Council speaks highly of your Sector 7 operation. Your transmissions to the Umbara Command Network," Vader said. 7 in 5 days, routed through the prisoner exchange channel during maintenance windows. The timing correlation to tactical anomalies has been documented, authenticated, and transmitted to the Council. The room temperature dropped. Not metaphorically. The force contracted around the space between them with the specific sensation that preceded violence, the way the air changes before lightning, a gathering of potential energy looking for a direction to resolve. Krell was still for exactly 4 seconds. Then he smiled, which was the most dangerous thing he could have done, because it was the smile of a man who had moved past the phase where denial was useful, and into the phase where he was deciding something else entirely. "You've been busy," he said. "Step outside, General. You're under investigation pending Council review. The 501st will provide." Krell moved. Not toward Vader. Toward the comm station. His upper right arm swept Jesse aside with the casual force of a man brushing something off a table, the clone trooper hitting the wall hard enough to crack his helmet's rear plate, and his lower left hand was already at the comm unit, a single deliberate action aimed not at destroying it, but at the transmission queue, at the evidentiary package sitting in the outgoing buffer waiting for its next relay window. Vader was out of his chair and between Krell and the comm unit before the Basilisk's hand reached the console. Not running. The force moved him the way it moved when there was no time for the body to negotiate with distance, a single fluid displacement that put him in a space he hadn't occupied the moment before. His hand closed around Krell's lower left wrist. The physical disparity was enormous. Krell outweighed him by a factor that should have made the grip academic, a detail rather than a constraint. But the grip was not physical. The force ran through it like current through a conductor, and Krell's arms stopped moving with the absolute authority of something that had encountered a force greater than its own momentum. The yellow eyes looked down at him. "You're stronger than I expected," Krell said, still calm, still with that patient, rotting quality in his voice. "The reports don't capture it. The comm unit stays intact," Vader said. "The transmission stays queued, and you are going to step back." Or, upper hands deploying them with the practiced synchronization of a man who had trained with 4 arms long enough that the coordination had become unconscious. Twin blades of green ignited in the command post's confined space, filling it with harsh light that made every shadow jump. Behind Vader, Rex's voice, "Fives, Jesse, clear the post." The clones moved, not retreating, repositioning, the specific tactical movement of soldiers creating space for a conflict that their weapons were not scaled to effect. Vader heard them go and did not look away from Krell. He ignited his own lightsaber. Blue light joined the green, and for a moment the command post held the 3 colors in suspension, blue and green, and the shadows between them, before Krell's first strike came down like a collapsing roof. Vader stepped inside it. This was the fundamental truth about fighting someone with a significant reach advantage. The reach advantage disappeared at close range. Krell's twin blades were devastating in open space, capable of covering angles that no single blade form was designed to address, but inside his own guard the geometry inverted, and the 4 arms became a liability, too many limbs in too little space, the lower pair interfering with the upper pair's recovery arc. Vader knew this because he had studied Krell in the other timeline, had read the after-action reports of every engagement the Basilisk general had survived, had spent 2 hours in the information silence of the supply valley, thinking through the specific tactical problem of a 4-armed combatant in a confined space. He pressed inward, and Krell was forced to give ground or accept the blade that was already moving through the space his body was occupying. Krell gave ground, through the command post's rear wall, not through the door. Through the wall, his upper shoulder dropping and driving through the prefabricated panel material with the momentum of a being who had decided that walls were a matter of perspective, and suddenly they were outside, on the ridge, in the gray, pre-dawn light of Umbara's perpetual almost morning. The clones who had been on perimeter duty scattered with the trained awareness of soldiers who had just correctly identified the blast radius of a situation. Vader heard Rex's voice somewhere behind him, directing them back, keeping them clear, the captain's tactical instinct understanding that inserting soldiers into this particular problem was how you converted soldiers into casualties. Krell attacked with full commitment. The twin blades came in 2 separate vectors, upper right on a diagonal cut, lower left on a horizontal sweep, the combination designed to split any opponent's attention into 2 problems that had no single solution. Against most opponents it worked, because most opponents could not process 2 simultaneous threats at different heights with different velocities while maintaining their own offensive initiative. Vader processed both and stepped between them. His blade caught the uppercut in a redirect rather than a block, using Krell's momentum against his recovery, and the lower sweep passed through space Vader had already vacated by dropping 3 inches, the green blade grazing the top of his pauldron and leaving a black score mark that he did not feel. He came out of the duck with a rising cut at Krell's lower left arm. Krell pulled it back, fast, faster than the size of him suggested was possible, and the blade missed by a centimeter that communicated something important. Krell was not fighting on instinct. He was fighting on calculation. Every movement was considered, every withdrawal precisely timed. The footwork of a man who had decided that this engagement had a specific desired outcome and was managing the distance to achieve it. He was moving toward the ridge crest. Vader realized it 3 steps before Krell reached it, the Basilisk using the engagement's natural flow to position himself at the point where the ridge dropped away into the terrain below, where the ground changed, where fighting in close quarters became fighting in open space, where the reach advantage returned. He let Krell reach it, because the ridge crest was also the position with the clearest sightline to the communication relay tower that Waxer had identified as the source of the prisoner exchange channel's unauthorized signal routing. And Vader had spent the last 3 hours ensuring that the relay tower had a very specific modification to its transmission queue that would activate when a force-sensitive individual with Krell's specific dark side signature came within 30 meters of it. The modification would complete the transmission of the evidentiary package through a backup relay channel that didn't require the command post's unit at all. Krell didn't know about the backup relay. He reached the crest and turned, twin blades spreading wide, the open ground behind him giving him everything the confined command post had taken away. His yellow eyes held the satisfaction of a man who had maneuvered to his preferred terrain and was ready to finish what had started. "You've been trained well," Krell said. "Better than any Padawan should be, but you're one blade against two, and you've just given me the ground." "I didn't give it to you," Vader said. He was breathing evenly. The dark side pulse in his chest was very steady, very certain. "You took exactly the position I needed you to take." Krell's eyes moved, just slightly, in the involuntary way of a man whose certainty has just developed a crack, checking his surroundings without wanting to appear to check his surroundings. 40 meters behind him, the communication relay tower's transmission indicator cycled from amber to green. The evidentiary package left Umbara at the speed of light, carrying with it 7 authenticated transmissions, 6 tactical anomaly correlations, Waxer's technical signature, and the complete record of what Pong Krell had done to the men of the 501st Legion. Vader felt it go. He lowered his blade. "The Council has the documentation," he said. "Everything. Fighting me now doesn't change that. Killing me now doesn't change that. Whatever you intended to prevent by coming here early, it's already done." Krell stood at the ridge crest, with his twin blades ignited and his yellow eyes, and his 4 arms, and the absolute stillness of a man whose calculation had just produced an answer he hadn't expected. "Surrender," Vader said. "Or don't, but understand what each choice costs you." The sky above Umbara did what it always did, flickered with something that was almost light, but wasn't quite. The planet's perpetual condition of being almost something and falling short. And Pong Krell stood in it, with his decisions and his crimes, and the specific loneliness of a man who had chosen the wrong side early enough that there was no longer a version of this that ended well for him. The blades stayed lit. Vader had expected that. Krell attacked with everything. Not the calculated management of distance that had defined the first engagement. Not the patient maneuvering toward preferred terrain. This was different in texture and different in intent. The violence of a man who had processed his options and arrived at the conclusion that the only remaining variable he could control was the magnitude of the damage he caused before the situation resolved itself against him. The twin blades came in sequences that had no defensive component whatsoever. Pure offense, pure aggression, each combination designed not to create an opening but to force an error through volume, to produce a mistake by making the problem too large and too fast for any single mind to solve cleanly. Vader solved it by not trying to solve all of it. This was the lesson that 20 years of Imperial enforcement had burned into his tactical understanding, past the point where it required conscious application. Against an opponent who was generating more offensive pressure than you could answer completely, you did not answer completely. You answered the parts that would kill you, and accepted the parts that wouldn't, and you used the energy of the parts you'd accepted to close the distance on the parts that mattered. Krell's upper left blade scored across his left forearm. The armor absorbed most of it. Not all of it. Vader felt the heat of it and filed the information under irrelevant and kept moving inward. His blade found Krell's lower right arm at the elbow joint. The limb did not separate cleanly. The angle was wrong, the movement too dynamic for the precision that kind of cut required. And what it produced instead was a deep score through the armor plating covering the joint, and a wound significant enough that the lower right arm dropped its blade and did not pick it up again. The lightsaber hit the ridge rock and rolled 2 meters and went dark. Krell made a sound that was not a scream. It was below a scream in register, a sound produced by a large body processing significant damage. And he stepped back, and his 3 remaining arms reorganized the 2 blades with the automatic adaptation of a fighter whose training had always accounted for injury. "You've been holding back," Krell said. His breathing had changed, still controlled, but carrying the specific quality of control that requires effort. "Since the command post, you've been operating at a fraction of what you are." Vader said nothing. It was true. He had been managing his force application with the care he applied to everything on this planet, not because he was uncertain of the outcome, but because the outcome had requirements. A dead Krell was a closed evidentiary file. An incapacitated Krell was a witness, a confession opportunity, a thread that led back through the separatist intelligence network that had been running him and would lead, eventually, to every contact he had made and every piece of Republic operational data he had transferred. But Krell was not moving toward incapacitation. He was moving toward the edge of the ridge, not retreating. The specific movement of a man who had identified a final option and was moving toward it with the deliberate pace of someone who had accepted what the option cost. Below the ridge, The terrain dropped 50 meters into the broken valley floor, where the bioluminescent ground cover pulsed in the early gray light. A fall that would not kill a Force-sensitive being, but would take time to recover from. Time enough to create distance. Time enough to make choices about what happened next. Vader moved to cut off the angle. Krell let him. It was the first moment in the engagement where Vader felt the quality of the situation shift, a subtle wrongness that arrived through the Force before his tactical mind had fully processed it. He was cutting off the retreat angle, but Krell had stopped moving toward the retreat angle 3 steps ago, had instead simply stopped, both blades raised, and was looking at a point over Vader's left shoulder, with an expression that had changed from the focused calculation of a combatant into something that was almost relief. Vader turned. Rex stood 10 meters behind him. His DC-17 was raised, aimed at Krell with the steady two-handed grip of a soldier who had made a decision and was at the stage past making it, the stage of execution. Behind Rex, in a loose arc that covered the ridge approach, Fives, Echo, Jesse, Hardcase and Waxer stood with their own weapons up. The 501st had come to the ridge. Not because Vader had ordered them there. He had explicitly ordered them clear. They had come because Rex had looked at the situation developing on the ridge and had made an independent command decision with the specific authority of a captain who understood that there were moments when following orders and fulfilling your responsibility to the men you commanded were not the same action. General Krell, Rex said. His voice had the quality that it had in the drainage channel, low and conserved. By order of the Jedi Council, you are under arrest for treason against the Republic. Stand down. The Council's order hasn't arrived yet, Captain, Krell said. Something in his voice had settled into a register that was almost conversational, the tone of a man who had moved through the phases of a situation and arrived at the final one with a certain dark equanimity. Technically, I still outrank you. Not on this ridge you don't, Rex said. Krell looked at the arc of clone troopers with their weapons raised, and then he looked at Vader, and in his yellow eyes was something that was not fear and not defiance, but a kind of recognition. The look of a man seeing the shape of his own ending clearly for the first time, and understanding that he has been moving toward it for longer than he realized. You knew, Krell said to Vader. Not suspected, knew, when you came to this planet, before the first anomaly, before Echo's analysis. You already knew what I was. Vader said nothing. The force of someone who has already lived through the consequences, Krell said slowly, with the quality of a man assembling understanding in real time. That's what's wrong with you. That's what I felt when I arrived. You're not what Skywalker should be, you're what he became. The yellow eyes had something in them now that was genuinely curious, the intellectual appetite of a man whose personal situation has become secondary to an interesting problem. What are you? Step away from the edge, Vader said. What did he become? You're Skywalker, in the timeline you remember. Krell's voice was calm with the specific calm of a man who has decided that this conversation is the last thing he intends to do, and is therefore in no hurry. Did he fall? I imagine he fell. The attachment, the emotion, someone he loved used as leverage. The Jedi are always destroyed by what they refuse to acknowledge about themselves. Vade looked at him. The dark side pulse in his chest was very still. He fell, Vader said. He became worse than you. He served the Sith Master who was using you the same way you used your troopers. Expendable, a tool with a finite operational lifespan. A beat. I imagine you knew that. Something moved across Krell's face. Sidious does not share power. No, he doesn't. Vader held his gaze. Whatever he promised you, whatever the Separatist command offered through Dooku's network, it was always going to end here. On a planet that doesn't matter, caught by the men you tried to destroy. That was always the design. Not yours. His. Then, you're trying to make me useful to you. A confession. Names. The network. Yes. The honesty of it seemed to land differently than argument would have. Krell was quiet, the twin blades still raised but no longer moving, the engagement in a state of suspension that had the quality of a held breath. The 501st, Rex said, and his voice had changed, had dropped into a register that was below operational, the voice of a man speaking for himself rather than for command. Tup Squad, the eastern approach on day 2, 12 men. You knew the Umbarans were waiting. Krell looked at Rex with those yellow eyes. He did not deny it. Rex's jaw moved once, the muscles working in the way they work when something is being held that would otherwise be something else. Why? Not a question. The word carried the specific weight of a question that has already processed enough of the answer to be angry about it, and is asking anyway because the full answer matters. The Republic is dying, Krell said. It came out with the quality of something that had been believed for a long time, and was being said for the first time in full. The Senate is corrupt beyond repair. The Jedi serve an institution that has already failed. I made a calculation about which side of the transition to be on. Sidious's empire will require generals. A pause. I intended to be one of them. The silence on the ridge was the silence of men who had just heard the arithmetic of their own deaths, laid out in administrative language. The casual accounting of a man who had weighed their lives against his career advancement and found them lighter. Five's voice came from the Arc, very quiet. He just told us why he did it. I heard him, Rex said. Hardcase said nothing. His weapon was very still. Vader looked at Krell, this large, patient, intelligent being who had looked at the galaxy's direction of travel and made a pragmatic decision that had cost 12 men their lives at the eastern approach, and more besides, who had calculated that the clone troopers under his command were a resource to be spent rather than soldiers to be led, who had been right about the Republic's trajectory and wrong about everything that mattered. The network, Vader said. Dooku's contact in the Umbaran command structure. The frequency and encryption keys for the prisoner exchange channel. Everything you transmitted and everything you received. You give us that and the Council hears that you cooperated. Krell looked at him for a long time. And if I don't? He let the ridge answer, the arc of clone troopers with their weapons raised, the gray light of Umbara's perpetual not-quite morning, the terrain below, the drop. You'll be tried, Vader said finally, with or without your cooperation. The documentation is already with the Council. The trial happens regardless. The cooperation affects the outcome. In the gesture of a man setting down something heavy while he considers whether to pick it up again. There are 3 contacts in the Umbaran command network, he said. One of them is not Umbaran. Name: a separatist intelligence coordinator operating under the designation Architect. The contact protocol uses a modified version of the prisoner exchange encryption with a secondary key I can provide. He recited it. A sequence of 40 characters, delivered with the precision of a man who had memorized it thoroughly because his life had depended on the memorization. Architect has been running intelligence operations in 6 active Republic campaigns simultaneously. The Umbara operation is one of 6. Vader committed the sequence to memory. The other 5 campaigns. 5 names. 5 active theaters where clone troopers were currently fighting under Jedi generals, while separatist intelligence used Republic doctrine to maximize their casualties. 5 campaigns that needed to know what Umbara had found. When he finished, the ridge was quiet. Rex lowered his weapon by 3 degrees, the specific downward adjustment of a soldier who has received the information he needed and is now doing the calculation that comes after it. Vader watched him do it, and knew what the calculation was producing before Rex had finished it. 12 men at the eastern approach, names that Rex could recite from memory because Rex knew every man in the 501st by name. A general who had fed their positions to the enemy for career advancement and had just finished cooperating and was standing at the edge of a 50-meter drop with 3 working limbs and 2 lightsabers. Captain Rex, Vader said quietly. Rex's weapon did not move. Rex! Vader put something in the word that was not a command. The voice he used when there was no rank between them, just 2 people on a ridge with a decision that had weight. Rex looked at him. His visor was unreadable. His body language was the specific stillness of a man who had arrived at a decision and was holding it in both hands and looking at it from every angle. He cooperated, Vader said. The Council gets him intact. A long moment. The kind that has texture. Then Rex lowered his weapon to his side. His voice was level with the precise levelness of something held very carefully. Cuff him. Fives and Echo moved forward. Krell did not resist. He allowed himself to be restrained with the specific passivity of a man who had decided that this was the shape of what came next, and was moving through it. The twin lightsabers extinguished, the large body reduced to something manageable by durasteel binders, and the exhaustion of a fight that had gone wrong. As they secured him, Krell looked at Vader one final time. Sidious will know what you've done here, he said. He'll adjust. He already has, Vader said. He's been adjusting for months. He just doesn't know yet that it isn't enough. They walked Krell off the ridge, as Umbara's sky did its usual thing, pressing down with its violet weight on a world that had never quite decided what kind of darkness it wanted to be. Behind them, the relay tower's transmission indicator stayed green. The transmission from Coruscant arrived 6 hours after Krell was secured. Not from Obi-Wan, not from the Council, from the Chancellor's office. Routed through the campaign's priority channel, with the specific authorization codes that bypassed standard military communication protocols and delivered directly to the commanding general's personal comm unit, which meant it had been transmitted by someone who understood exactly how to ensure it was received privately before anyone else knew it existed. Vader looked at the transmission request for a long moment before accepting it. The holographic projector on the field table produced a figure at 1/3 scale, blue-tinted and slightly flattened by the long-range compression, but recognizable. Palpatine sat behind his desk in the posture he used for private communications, the one that was different from his public posture in ways that most people never noticed because they were looking at the wrong things. The public posture was performative, designed to project benevolent authority. The private posture was still, watchful, the posture of something that was always measuring the distance between itself and whatever it was looking at. "My boy," Palpatine said. 2 words, and in them the entire architecture of a manipulation that had taken decades to construct. The warmth was genuine in the way that a weapon is genuine, real and present and entirely purposeful. Vader sat across from the hologram and felt nothing that young Anakin would have felt. No warmth in response, no reflexive pleasure at being addressed with affection by the man who had treated him like a son when the Jedi Council had treated him like a problem. He felt the dark side pulse in his chest, and the cold, clear recognition of a man looking at the thing that had destroyed him, and seeing it clearly for what it was. "Chancellor," he said. Something shifted microscopically in Palpatine's expression. The word. Not the warmth of my master or the deference of Chancellor Palpatine, but the flat single word of a man establishing distance rather than closing it. Palpatine's perceptions were too refined for that shift to pass unnoticed, and the thing that happened in his eyes in response to it was not visible as an expression so much as a quality, the quality of a mind adjusting its approach in real time. "I've received the Council's preliminary report on the Krell situation," Palpatine said. "Disturbing business. A Jedi general in communication with Separatist intelligence. It speaks to the difficulty of maintaining institutional integrity under the pressures of a prolonged conflict." A pause, timed with the precision of a man who used pauses the way other men used words. "You've done remarkable work, Anakin. The Council is impressed. I am impressed." "Thank you, Chancellor." The response was correct in form and empty in content, and Palpatine heard the emptiness. Vader watched him hear it, the slight stillness that moved through the holographic figure, the recalibration happening behind eyes that had been reading people for decades. "The Krell investigation will naturally require significant Council resources over the coming weeks," Palpatine continued, moving to the next element of whatever this conversation had been designed to accomplish. The network he's identified, this architect operative, the parallel campaigns being compromised. It's a complex situation requiring careful management. Another pause. The Council will want to move carefully, methodically. These things take time. "They do," Vader said. "In the interim, the 5 compromised campaigns will need to be addressed. Quietly, if possible. Public knowledge of the scope of the intelligence breach would damage Republic morale at a critical juncture." Palpatine's voice carried the specific quality of a man raising a practical concern rather than making a directive. "I've spoken with Mas Amedda about the most efficient approach to managing the information. We believe a limited disclosure carefully framed. The commanding generals of the 5 compromised campaigns need to know immediately," Vader said. "Today, through Council channels, their troopers are dying on compromised intelligence right now, in real time, while we're having this conversation." The pause that followed was different from the previous ones. Not the timed pause of a rhetorician, the pause of a man who has just encountered a wall where he expected a door. "Anakin," Palpatine said, and now the warmth in the voice had a different component underneath it, something that was almost gentle in the way that things are gentle when they contain a warning. "I understand your concern for the troops. Your loyalty to the men under your command is one of your finest qualities. But the strategic implications of a broad disclosure. 5 campaigns, thousands of troopers, Jedi generals operating on intelligence that an enemy asset has had access to for months. Vader held the hologram's gaze. There is no version of that situation where the strategic value of information control outweighs the operational cost of leaving those generals uninformed. You're thinking tactically, Palpatine said. I'm asking you to think politically. I know. 2 words, and in them the entire shape of the conversation that Palpatine had come here to have. The Chancellor wanted the Krell situation managed in a way that contained its scope, minimized its visibility, moved the information through channels that he controlled at a pace that served his timeline. Broad, immediate disclosure would produce council investigations, military reviews, the kind of institutional scrutiny that created problems for a man who was simultaneously running the Republic and orchestrating its destruction. Palpatine looked at him across the holographic distance. You've changed, he said, not accusatory. Observational, with the precision of a man who had been watching for change and had now decided he was seeing it. The Council's reports from Umbara, the tactical performance, the methods, even the way you're speaking to me now. The old eyes moved across his face with the attention of a reader working through a difficult text. Something happened to you. I've always known you were exceptional, Palpatine continued, and now the warmth had been set aside entirely, replaced by something that was almost honest in its directness. The specific honesty of a man who has decided that the tool he thought he had requires reassessment. I've always known your potential exceeded the Jedi Order's willingness to acknowledge it. But this is different from potential. This feels like experience. The campaign has been educational, Vader said. No. Palpatine's voice was very quiet. That's not what I mean, and you understand that it's not what I mean. A long pause. Who are you? The question landed with the specific weight of a question that has been building for weeks and has finally been asked. Not who are you as a challenge, not who are you as an accusation, but who are you as a genuine inquiry from a man whose model of the person he was speaking to had developed enough inconsistencies that the model itself required revision. I'm Anakin Skywalker, Vader said. I'm the general who kept Pong Krell from finishing what you sent him here to do. The holographic figure went very still. It was not the stillness of surprise. It was the stillness of a man who has been moving through a carefully constructed performance and has just been informed that his audience has known it was a performance since before it began. The specific stillness of a position being abandoned and a new one being selected. That's a serious accusation, Palpatine said. It's the same kind of accusation I transmitted to the Council 6 hours ago with 7 authenticated transmissions, 40-character encryption keys, the identification of an operative called Architect, and the names of 5 parallel campaigns. Vader leaned forward slightly. The documentation doesn't mention you by name. Not yet. Because what I have connects to Krell and through Krell to Dooku's network, and the chain is long enough that it will take investigators time to follow it to its end. Palpatine looked at him. But I know where the chain ends, Vader said. And you know that I know. So this conversation is you trying to understand how much I've told the Council, and whether there's anything you can still manage. He held the yellow-tinged holographic gaze. There isn't. The transmission is complete. The Council has everything I have. You cannot undo that. The silence stretched. When Palpatine spoke again, his voice had changed one more time, settling into a register that Vader recognized from the other timeline. From the private moments in the Emperor's throne room, when Palpatine had set aside the performance entirely because he was speaking to someone he considered his equal in understanding, if not in power. The register of genuine engagement. You're not afraid of me, Palpatine said. No. Most people who understand what I am are afraid. Most people who understand what you are haven't watched you die, Vader said. The words landed and stayed. Palpatine absorbed them with the stillness of a man processing information that has arrived in an unexpected form, turning it over, testing it for the shape of what it implied. An interesting thing to say, he said finally. It's the truth. And yet here I am. Here you are, Vader agreed. In a timeline where Krell is in custody, where the Council has documentation of separatist intelligence penetration reaching into Republic military command. And where I am still standing on Umbara having a conversation with you that you initiated because you needed to assess how much damage has been done. He paused. The damage is significant. Not fatal to your plans. Not yet. But significant. Palpatine regarded him with those ancient eyes. The warmth was entirely gone now, the grandfather mask entirely absent, and what looked out from the holographic figure was the thing that had always been behind it. Patient and cold and genuinely intelligent, the real face of Darth Sidious, assessing a variable that had stopped behaving like a variable and had started behaving like an opposing player. "What do you want?" Palpatine asked. "Not negotiating. Mapping. The first question a strategist asks when the situation has moved past the point where it can be resolved by force or deception and has entered the territory of understanding what the other side actually requires." "I want the war to end," Vader said. "I want the clones treated as soldiers rather than instruments. I want the 5 compromised campaigns notified today through council channels regardless of your management preferences." He kept his voice even. "And I want you to understand that every move you make from this point forward is being watched by someone who knows your methods better than you know mine." A long silence. "You're declaring war on me," Palpatine said. "I'm telling you the terms under which I won't," Vader said. "There's a difference." Palpatine looked at him for a long moment, with the expression of a man filing information in a very specific category of information, the category reserved for things that were both dangerous and interesting, the category that Palpatine had always found more compelling than the things that were only dangerous. "The 5 campaigns will be notified," Palpatine said, "through council channels." Today, Vader said nothing. "You should understand," Palpatine continued, and his voice had taken on the quality of something being said for the record, rather than for the room, "that I have been building towards something for a very long time. What you know about me, what you've transmitted, what you believe you can prevent, these are variables I can account for." "I know," Vader said. "I used to be one of your variables." Palpatine's eyes held on him for 3 seconds that contained more calculation than most people produced. "In an hour." Then the holographic figure moved, a small gesture that was not quite a bow and not quite an acknowledgement, but contained elements of both. The gesture of a man marking a moment as significant before moving past it. "We will speak again, Anakin Skywalker," he said. "Yes," Vader said. "We will." The transmission closed. The field table held only the ambient light of the command post, the flickering pulse of the tactical display, the gray pre-dawn filtering through the gaps in the prefabricated walls. Rex appeared in the doorway. He had not been in the room for the transmission. He had been stationed outside it, close enough to respond, far enough to provide plausible deniability about what had been said. His posture asked the question his voice hadn't formed yet. "The 5 campaigns will receive notification today," Vader said. Rex's posture changed. 1 degree, barely visible, the specific change of a soldier whose tension has been partially resolved. "And Krell, trial, whatever comes after. And the Chancellor," Vader looked at the space where the hologram had been, "knows that we know," he said. "Which changes nothing about what he intends to do, and everything about how carefully he'll do it from here." Rex absorbed this. "That sounds like the beginning of something, rather than the end." "It is," Vader said. "It's also the first time in this war that he's had to be careful." He stood from the field table and walked to the command post entrance, stepping out onto the ridge into the gray Umbaran pre-dawn, the sky doing its usual impression of a storm that had forgotten what it was building toward. Behind him, Rex followed. Ahead of them, the capital of Umbara sat in the dark and waited for what was coming. The capital had been designed to be taken from above. Not in the sense that it was vulnerable from above. The opposite. Every defensive layer the Umbaran military had constructed around their primary urban center assumed that the Republic's strategic doctrine would follow its standard pattern: aerial bombardment to suppress anti-aircraft infrastructure, followed by gunship-supported ground assault through the primary approach corridors, followed by urban pacification moving from the outer districts inward toward the government center. The assumption was correct. It was also, Vader had decided 3 days ago, the reason a standard assault would cost the 501st a third of its remaining strength before they reached the government center's outer wall. He had spent those 3 days not attacking. This had produced a specific quality of tension in the command post that was different from the tension of active combat. Combat tension had direction. It pointed at something, it burned in a particular way. Waiting tension had no direction and burned differently. A slower combustion, harder to manage, harder to explain to resolve problems through movement. Rex had managed it. This was one of the things that made Rex exceptional in ways that went beyond tactical competence. He had read the men's restlessness and had given it productive forms, drills, position improvements, equipment maintenance, the endless small tasks of a military unit that needed to remain operationally sharp without burning its edge on unnecessary action. He had done this without being asked and without explanation, which meant he had understood the waiting without being told why it was necessary. On the fourth morning, the supply route modification produced its first measurable effect. Kix brought the intelligence report to Vader at dawn, a thermal analysis of the capital's forward defensive positions showing a 17% reduction in active power signatures across the Eastern Hardpoint network. The modified cells had reached the forward installations and been integrated into the power relay chain, and the feedback loop that Echo had engineered was doing exactly what Echo had said it would do, propagating inward through the Umbara grid with the patient thoroughness of a process that didn't know it was supposed to stop. 18 hours to critical degradation on the Eastern network, Echo said, standing at the tactical display with his arms crossed and the specific satisfaction of someone watching careful work arrive at its intended outcome. After that, their Eastern corridor loses coordinated fire control. Individual emplacements can still fire manually, but they can't coordinate targeting across the network. Which means the Eastern corridor becomes the primary approach, Jesse said. Which is why we're not using the Eastern corridor, Vader said. Jesse looked at the map, looked at Vader, performed the recalibration. Sir, the Eastern corridor is where they'll concentrate whatever mobile reserves they have left after the grid degradation. They'll read the power failure correctly, understand it compromises their Eastern network, and move to compensate with bodies. Vader pulled the capital's map to its full display, every district, every approach vector, every defensive layer that Republic intelligence had been able to map. They'll be right that the Eastern corridor is the most viable approach after the degradation. They'll be wrong about which approach we're actually using. Fives studied the map with the intensity he brought to tactical problems he found genuinely interesting. The northern maintenance tunnels, he said. Not a question. He had found it himself, the same way he found most things, by looking at the parts of the map that appeared least significant. They run under the outer defensive perimeter, water and power infrastructure for the civilian districts, built before the war, not military construction. Not in any Republic tactical assessment, not in any Umbaran defensive plan. He looked around the table at the faces that had been with him since the drainage channel, Rex and Fives and Echo, and Jesse and Kix, and Hardcase, the specific faces of men who had survived this campaign by learning to trust a general who operated outside the boundaries of their training, because they're not wide enough for a full assault force. Hardcase said, how many? 12. 2 fire teams. Objective is not the government center. Objective is the central power hub. Vader indicated the location on the map, deep in the capital's interior, the architectural heart of the city's defensive network. The hub controls not just the power grid, but the communications array, the automated defense systems, the emergency protocols. Taking the hub doesn't capture the capital. It takes the capital's ability to coordinate its own defense. And then, Rex asked, and then the Eastern corridor stops being a trap and starts being a door. Vader stepped back from the table. The 501st advances through the Eastern corridor under your command after the hub falls. Standard assault protocols. By that point, the Umbarans will be fighting without coordination, without automated systems, without the ability to communicate between defensive positions. They'll still fight, but they'll be fighting alone. The room was quiet, with the specific quiet of men running the plan through their internal models, and finding that it resolved. Then, Hardcase said, with genuine feeling, I want to be in the 12. I know, Vader said. You are. The maintenance tunnels smelled of minerals and standing water, and the specific biological undertone that everything on Umbara carried, the living planet asserting its presence even in the infrastructure designed to contain it. Vader moved through them at a crouch, the tunnel's ceiling 40 centimeters above his head. The bioluminescent organisms that colonized the tunnel walls, providing enough light to navigate by, and enough movement in the light to make every shadow seem like it was breathing. Behind him, in single file, 11 clone troopers moved with the compressed efficiency of men who had learned to make themselves smaller than their armor suggested was possible. Fives was directly behind him, Echo behind Fives. The rest in an order Rex had determined based on the specific skills required at each phase of the approach. Demolitions capability near the front for obstacles. Medical capability at the rear for extraction, the particular logic of a captain who had thought through every way this could develop. Rex was not here. Rex was on the ridge with the 501st, waiting. That had been the hardest part. Not the planning, not the conversation with Palpatine, not the duel with Krell, telling Rex that the Eastern Corridor assault required him at the front of it, that the 12 going into the tunnels needed a different kind of leader, and Rex needed to be visible to the men advancing behind him. Rex had received this with the specific silence of a soldier who understood the tactical logic and would have preferred a different assignment regardless. "Sir," Rex had said, before they split, "come back. Not a military instruction. The other kind." Vader had not responded to it in words. He had held Rex's gaze for a moment with the specific acknowledgement of one person to another that does not require language, and then he had turned and walked toward the tunnel entrance, with 11 men behind him. He felt the hub through the Force, before the tunnel opened into it, a concentration of mechanical energy with the dense electrical signature of significant infrastructure. Power flowing through it in volumes that produced a faint vibration in the tunnel walls that he had been tracking for the last 400 meters as a navigational reference. He raised a fist. The column stopped. He extended his senses into the space beyond the tunnel's end. 4 Umbaran guards positioned at the hub's internal access points, 2 at the primary entrance, 2 at the maintenance corridor junction that the tunnel opened onto. Standard positioning for a facility that wasn't expecting to be approached from below. He turned and held up 4 fingers. Fives nodded. The information moved back through the column in the silent communication of soldiers who had been operating together long enough to have developed a non-verbal vocabulary adequate for complex tactical exchanges. Vader moved to the tunnel's end. The junction beyond was a circular chamber where 3 maintenance corridors converged. The hub's entrance, a heavy blast door on the far wall. 2 Umbaran guards at its base, with light-based weapons in the low-ready position of soldiers doing routine security rather than active defense. To his left, the junction to the secondary access point, another 20 meters of corridor, and another 2 guards. He came through the tunnel opening and neutralized both junction guards with the Force before they registered his presence. 2 precise applications of telekinetic pressure that produced no sound and left both soldiers unconscious against the chamber wall. 8 seconds later, Fives and Echo had managed the secondary access point with the same absence of complication. The blast door required Echo. 20 seconds of technical work that would have taken someone else 4 minutes, his hands moving through the access panel with the efficiency of a man who had been solving this specific category of problem since before the war had a name. The door opened. The hub was a vertical space, 3 stories of interconnected power architecture built around a central column that hummed with the specific frequency of a system running at high load. Control consoles lined the walls at each level, Umbaran engineers at 6 of them, managing the grid's distribution with the focused attention of professionals who were deep in their work and had been given no reason to look toward the door. They looked toward the door. Vader walked in. What followed was not a battle. It was a negotiation conducted in a language that the Umbaran engineers understood immediately and completely. The language of a Force-sensitive being standing in the entrance of your workplace with 11 armed soldiers behind him, and the specific posture of a man who has already decided how this resolves and is waiting for the room to reach the same. Conclusion. 3 minutes later, the hub's engineering staff were seated against the far wall with their hands visible, and Hardcase was at the central control console with an expression of intense concentration and genuine pleasure at the complexity of the system he had been asked to disable. "Give me 5 minutes," Hardcase said. 4, Vader said. Hardcase's expression shifted to something that was challenge accepted without the words. His hands moved across the console with a certainty that was interesting to watch, the specific confidence of someone whose technical knowledge had always exceeded what people expected from him, because people made assumptions based on his enthusiasm for explosives, and missed the fact that enthusiasm for explosives requires a fairly sophisticated understanding of energy systems. 3 minutes and 40 seconds later, the capital's coordinated defense network went offline. Not with a dramatic failure, with the quiet, definitive cessation of a system that had been managing itself and had stopped. The hum in the central column changed pitch and then settled into silence. The consoles shifted from active display to emergency amber. Outside, in the tunnels below them and in the streets above them, and in the eastern corridor where Rex was waiting with the 501st, Umbara experienced the specific disorientation of a defensive network that had been speaking to all of its parts simultaneously and had suddenly gone quiet. Vader opened his comm. "Rex, Heard the hum stop, Rex said. We're moving. The Eastern Corridor assault took 11 minutes. Vader listened to it through the comm, while Hardcase ensured the hub's systems couldn't be restarted from the engineering stations, and Echo compiled a copy of every piece of data the hub's network contained, which included Umbaran military architecture, defensive plans for 6 other installations, and a communication log that would take Republic intelligence analysts weeks to fully process. The sounds of the assault were the sounds of a military operation executing against an enemy that had lost its coordination. Individual engagements that were fierce but brief. The 501st moving through resistance that was brave and disorganized against a force that was disciplined and had direction. Rex's voice came through the comm at intervals, clipped and factual, the voice of a captain doing the work. Eastern perimeter secured. First defensive ring neutralized. Second ring falling back. Government district entry. No significant casualties. Vader heard those 3 words and felt something in his chest that was not the dark side pulse, and was not tactical satisfaction but something quieter and more personal. The specific relief of a man who had spent 20 years reading casualty reports and had just heard the number he had been working towards since the drainage channel. The government center's commanders surrendered 40 minutes after the hub fell. Not because they had no options. Because their defensive network was down, their forward positions had been overrun, their supply chain had been compromised for days. And a Republic general was standing in their communications center with 11 soldiers, and the patience of someone who was content to wait for the arithmetic of the situation to produce its inevitable conclusion. Vader accepted the surrender with the formality it required, and none of the ceremony it didn't. When he walked out of the government center into Umbara's gray light, Rex was standing at the bottom of the steps, with his helmet under his arm, and an expression that contained several things simultaneously: the professional satisfaction of a successful campaign, the specific exhaustion of a soldier at the end of something that had cost more than campaigns were supposed to cost, and something underneath both of those that was harder to name. "Sir," Rex said. Vader stood beside him and looked at the capital. The Umbaran city spread around them in its alien architecture, all hard angles and biological integration, beautiful in the specific way of things that had evolved to thrive in permanent darkness. 12, Rex said quietly. In the tunnels. You came back with 12. I know. A pause. Tup's squad. The 12 at the eastern approach. Rex looked at the city. It doesn't cancel. I'm not saying it cancels. It doesn't, Vader agreed. But it matters, Rex said. Coming back with 12. It matters. Vader looked at the gray sky and felt the dark side pulse in his chest, and the weight of 20 years of other campaigns on which the count at the end had been different, had been worse, had been the result of decisions made by a man who had not been trying to bring anyone back. Yes, he said, it does. Behind them, the 501st secured the capital of Umbara. The debrief took 3 days, not because the events of the Umbara campaign were difficult to document, because the events of the Umbara campaign were difficult to contain. Every report that left the planet generated 2 more requests from Council investigators, who had begun pulling threads from the Krell documentation, and were finding that each thread connected to something larger than the one before it, a network of compromised intelligence operations, a pattern of manufactured casualties, a systematic exploitation of the Republic's military infrastructure that had been running long enough to have developed its own institutional momentum. Vader answered every question with the precision of a man who had decided exactly how much of what he knew to provide and in what order. Not deception. Architecture. The Council needed to understand the scope of what had happened on Umbara before they were ready to hear the larger thing it pointed toward. And the larger thing required a foundation of documented, verified, unambiguous fact before it could be introduced without being dismissed. He was building the foundation. Obi-Wan arrived on the 2nd day, not as a council representative, or not only as that. He came in the way he came when the official purpose of a visit was genuine, but secondary to the actual one, wearing the administrative necessity like a coat over something more personal. He found Vader at the perimeter of the secured government center, sitting on the steps of a requisitioned building with a ration block he was not eating, and the particular stillness that Obi-Wan had learned, across years of observation, to recognize as thinking rather than rest. He sat beside him without preamble. For a while, neither of them spoke. This was one of the things Obi-Wan had always been capable of, that young Anakin had never adequately appreciated, the ability to inhabit silence without filling it, to be present without requiring the presence to announce itself. Vader had learned to appreciate it across 20 years of its absence. "The Council is satisfied with the campaign documentation," Obi-Wan said finally. "Krell's trial is being scheduled. The 5 parallel campaigns have been notified and their intelligence assessments are being reviewed." A pause. Massa Meta attempted to delay the notifications by 48 hours through administrative channels. The Council overrode him. "Good. Mace wanted me to tell you specifically that your tactical performance on this campaign will be used in strategic planning curriculum." Obi-Wan's voice carried a dry quality that was not quite amusement, but lived. In its vicinity, he used the word unprecedented. It cost him something. It usually does. Another silence. The Umbaran sky pressed down with its customary indifference. The gray-violet light that had been the constant backdrop of everything that had happened here, the color of a world that had decided permanent twilight was sufficient. "The Chancellor contacted me," Obi-Wan said. "The morning after your transmission, he expressed concern about your psychological state, suggested that the campaign had been unusually stressful and that you might benefit from evaluation. He said it without emphasis, simply placing the information in the space between them for examination. He was very warm about it, very concerned." "He was mapping what I'd told you," Vader said, "understanding how much of our conversation you were aware of." "That was my read as well." Obi-Wan looked at his hands for a moment. "He knows something is wrong. With you. He can't identify what it is, and that bothers him more than if he could." "Yes. Should it bother me?" Vader considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Obi-Wan was not asking whether Vader was dangerous. He was asking something more precise, whether the thing that had changed in the person he had trained for 10 years was something he needed to understand in order to respond to it correctly. The question of a man who trusted his instincts and was trying to determine whether his instincts had enough information to work with. "I'm not going to fall," Vader said. "Not the way you're afraid of." "I'm afraid of several ways," Obi-Wan said. "Be specific." Vader looked at the Umbaran city spread around them, the alien architecture that had spent the last 10 days trying to kill the men he commanded, and had failed. "In another life I fell because I was alone. Because I had things I was trying to protect, and nowhere to put the fear of losing them that didn't make the fear worse. Because the people I trusted most operated from institutional obligation when I needed something that wasn't institutional." He paused. "I'm not alone now, and I know the difference between someone asking questions because they're required to, and someone asking because they want to understand." Obi-Wan was quiet for a moment. "You're describing a specific experience." "I am. One you're not going to explain in full." "Not yet. But eventually, Obi-Wan absorbed this with the patience he had always brought to the things that required it. Then he said, in the voice he used when he was being precise rather than diplomatic, "The Chancellor. What you said to him, what you implied about knowing what he is. A beat. How much do you know?" "Enough," Vader said. "Not enough that the Council can act on it yet. The Krell documentation creates a thread. The thread leads to Dooku's network. Dooku's network leads to a Sith Master operating at the highest levels of the Republic. The investigators will reach that conclusion on their own, if we give them time and ensure they're looking in the right places. And if we run out of time, then I tell you everything I know and we act on it directly." Vader held his former master's gaze. "But Obi-Wan, when that moment comes, when I tell you who it is, and where he is, and what he intends to do, I need you to believe me without the documentation. I need you to trust what I'm telling you before the proof arrives." Obi-Wan looked at him for a long moment, with the focused attention he brought to the things that required his full perception. "You're asking me to decide now whether I'll trust you then?" "Yes." Another long silence. The Umbaran sky did its usual thing, flickered with something that was not quite light. "Yes," Obi-Wan said. "I will." Rex found Vader in the 501st's assembly area on the 3rd morning, moving between the men with the specific purpose of a captain who had learned that the period immediately after a campaign's conclusion was when soldiers needed their commanding officer visible and unhurried, present without agenda. The 501st was packing for departure, the practical business of a military unit preparing to leave a place it had taken at significant cost, the equipment loaded, and the positions handed off to the garrison troops, who would maintain the occupation, the small personal items stowed, the things that didn't pack that soldiers carried regardless. Vader walked through it, And the men looked at him, and something passed between the looking and being looked at that was not a formal acknowledgement, not a salute, not a report. The thing that exists between soldiers who have been through something specific together and know that the specificity of it belongs to them and not to the official record. He stopped at the section where Toop's squad had been. The space was occupied now by a different fire team, reassigned after the eastern approach, but the section still had the specific quality of a space where someone had been and wasn't anymore. The particular absence of 12 men whose gear no longer occupied their positions. Rex came alongside him and stood there for a moment. "Their names are in the official record," Rex said. "Every one of them." "I know. I'm going to make sure they stay there," Rex said. That the official record doesn't get summarized down to a casualty figure in a strategic assessment. His voice had the quiet certainty of a man stating an intention rather than a preference. That someone reads those names and knows they were people. Vader looked at the empty section. In the other timeline, the names of clone troopers had not been kept with the same care as the names of Jedi generals, had not been weighted with the same institutional gravity, had been the smaller numbers inside the larger numbers of campaign statistics. The Republic had been better about it than the Empire, but not by as much as it should have been. "Rex," he said, "what I told you about Krell, before the evidence, before the documentation, when I said watch how he talks about acceptable losses, sir, there are others like him, not many, but the conditions that produced Krell, the distance between command and consequence, the institutional habit of treating clone casualties as a different category from Jedi casualties, the assumption that troopers are instruments rather than soldiers, those conditions exist beyond one general." Rex was very still. "Yes, sir. I know. When you encounter those conditions, in whatever campaign comes after this, in whatever command structure you're operating under." Vader turned to look at him directly. "Document it, report it, and if the documentation doesn't produce a response, report it again through a different channel." Rex looked at him. "And if there is no channel that responds, then you and I will have a conversation about what comes next." It was more than he had intended to say, and precisely what needed to be said, and Rex received it with the gravity of a man who understood that he had just been given something that wasn't an instruction, and wasn't a permission, but existed in the space between them, a commitment made between two people, rather than between a general and a captain. "Understood, sir," Rex said quietly. Fives appeared at Rex's shoulder, with the timing he had for appearing at moments he had no official reason to be part of. He looked between them with his characteristic expression of a man who had caught enough of a conversation to understand its weight without having heard its content. "Ships are ready," he said. "Departure in 2 hours." Vader looked at the assembly area one final time. The 501st preparing to leave Umbara. The men moving through the practical business of departure with the specific energy of soldiers who had survived something and were ready to be somewhere else. Echo checking equipment manifests. Kix doing final medical assessments. Hardcase helping 2 troopers wrestle an equipment case into a transport with unnecessary enthusiasm and entirely necessary strength. Waxer catching his eye from across the area and nodding once, the nod of a man who had pulled comm logs at his captain's request, and understood the weight of what those logs had contained, and had never mentioned it to anyone who didn't need to know. These men, these specific men with their specific histories, and their specific loyalty that had been built from shared ground on a planet that had been trying to kill them for 10 days, and had failed. In the other timeline, they had eventually turned on their generals. The chips had fired and the bodies had fallen, and the 501st had become the unit that marched on the Jedi Temple in white armor and did not hesitate. Vader had led them there, had walked through those halls with these men behind him, and had not looked at them because looking at them would have required acknowledging what he had made them do. He looked at them now. He looked at all of them and felt the dark side pulse in his chest with its familiar rhythm, and felt, alongside it, something that had no dark side component whatsoever. Something that was simply the recognition of people who had chosen to follow him and had not been failed by the choice. Not yet. Not on this planet. He intended to keep it that way. The transports lifted from Umbara 2 hours later, climbing through the violet-gray atmosphere into the black above it, the planet receding below them into a sphere of permanent twilight. The surface scarred with the specific marks of a campaign that had been fought and resolved, and would be studied, and would become, eventually, The kind of historical record that produced lessons in strategic planning curriculum and footnotes in broader histories of the Clone Wars. The broader histories would not capture what had actually happened on Umbara. They never did. They would capture the tactical innovations, the intelligence breach, the Krell prosecution, the hub operation, and the Eastern Corridor assault. They would record the casualty figures and the campaign duration and the strategic outcome. They would not record the conversation at the drainage channel or the quality of Rex's silence on the ridge, or the specific way Fives had looked at the transmission log when he understood what the timestamps meant, or the 12 men Vader had walked out of the maintenance tunnels with, or what Rex had said when he counted them. Those things would live only in the people who had been there. Vader stood at the transport's viewport and watched Umbara disappear, and thought about what came next. The Krell investigation threading toward Dooku, Dooku threading toward Sidious, Sidious making adjustments with the patience of a man who had been making adjustments for decades and had not yet encountered an adjustment he couldn't account for. He would encounter one. Vader had made sure of it on this planet, not by defeating Palpatine, not by exposing him, not by any single action that resolved the problem cleanly, by building something. A record, an alliance, a set of people who had looked at how the war was being conducted and had chosen to conduct it differently, who had documentation and names and the specific knowledge that institutional silence was not the same thing as institutional integrity. Obi-Wan, who had promised to believe him when the moment came. Rex, who would document and report and eventually, if necessary, act. The Council, which had evidence it was still learning to read. A seed, not a solution. The solution required time and precision, and the willingness to be patient in a situation that generated pressure against patience at every turn. Vader was patient. He had learned it the hard way in a life that had run to its bitter end, before depositing him in an elevator on Coruscant with the full weight of its consequences and the impossible gift of a chance to carry them differently. He turned from the viewport as Umbara vanished into the dark behind them. There was work to do. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.